Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on why atheists miss the mark in their criticisms of Pascal's Wager. Atheism, it seems to me, has a lot to teach Christians if the atheism is defended in a rigorous and rational way, and if the atheist who is defending his or her objections to God belief really knows the tradition to which he or she is objecting. However, what really bothers me are atheistic objections to Christianity in particular and religion in general that really know very little, if anything, about the tradition that they are criticizing. And in point of fact, also tend to know very little about philosophical argumentation. There's no finesse, there's no sophistication in their arguments. I think this is especially the case with the so-called Four Horsemen, the new atheists who arose about 20 years ago and who gained almost overnight celebrityhood because of their militant objections to Christianity. I'm speaking, of course, of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. Of the four, Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett are trained in philosophy, but they seem to be so prejudiced against religious belief in general that one has to read their arguments with a great deal of skepticism. Dawkins and Hitchens are not trained in philosophy, and yet they are the most outspoken and strident atheists of the four, and they typically manhandle the arguments that they're trying to offer. I think one of the prime examples of this manhandling is with Pascal's Wager. Christopher Hitchens, in particular, made a mark for himself by going after it in almost identical ways every opportunity. Hitchens argues, for example, that it is a huckster kind of move, Pascal's Wager, that what it tries to do is to encourage people of goodwill and integrity to dishonestly throw over a lifetime of well thought through principles, that it is appealing to emotion and is flim-flamming whoever hears it. Now, that's a pretty shoddy response to Pascal's Wager, and in fact, it's not an argument against Pascal's Wager at all, so much as it is just a venting, just a ranting. But interestingly enough, we see a similar criticism by no less a thinker than William James. William James, in his classic article, The Will to Believe, actually accuses Pascal's Wager of putting people in the position of being unworthy of the divine reward that James thinks the Pascalian wager is intended to bring them. James misunderstands Pascal's Wager as well, although he's less crude in his objection to it. So, what is Pascal's Wager, and why should we Christians and non-Christians as well take it seriously? Pascal, of course, is that 17th century brilliant man. He was a polymath. He was a mathematician. He invented the first calculating machine, apparently in order to help his accountant father total up his numbers at the end of the day. He did groundbreaking work when it comes to the geometry of cones. He experimented with vacuums. And he was a pioneer in probability theory. Curiously enough, his interest in probability theory was piqued by aristocratic gamblers asking him to help them figure out the probability of success in their betting. And that's going to be important, as we'll see in just a few moments. But toward the end of his life, in 1654, he only had about 7 more years to live, he had a religious experience. Now, he had been religious up to that point, but this appears to have been one of those overwhelming religious experiences which diverted his attention away from his earlier mathematical and scientific researches toward religious apologetics. And he began writing a book which he hoped would be a vast compendium of Christian apologetics. And he would jot down hundreds and hundreds of notes on scraps of paper. But he died before he could put all of the scraps of paper together. They were collated after his death, and they are entitled Pensées, or Thoughts, Reflections. And in spite of their fragmentary nature, they are some of the most masterful and beautiful writings from a French author of the 17th century. Now, it's in Palsy, it's in this book of fragmented thoughts about religion that we find the so-called wager, Pascal's wager. Several things need to be said about the wager before I actually tell you what it is. In the first place, it is not a proof for the existence of God. Many atheists insist that it is and that it falls short, but in saying that, they miss the mark because Pascal never intended it to be a proof. In fact, Pascal is quite clear in the Pensées that one cannot prove the existence of God because God is incomprehensible. So reason will not demonstrate God's existence, nor will reason demonstrate God's non-existence. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is this. Pascal's wager was written, he tells us, for those people who are sitting on the fence when it comes to whether or not God exists, for those people who haven't made up their mind, neither atheist nor theist, but those people who are uncertain, either because they're simply indifferent or because they just don't know where to go, since reason can't be the arbiter in deciding the question. Now, a skeptic, an atheist, says to Pascal, he's imagining this conversation, well, in point of fact, people then ought not to choose. People ought to just remain indifferent, remain on the fence if there's no reason for or against. But Pascal has a really interesting response to that. He says, listen, we are already embarked on this adventure. You and I, whether we believe in God or not, are already in the midst of life. And life simply demands that we take seriously certain fundamental questions, even if those questions can't be definitively, comprehensively, and rationally answered. And the third point that we need to keep in mind is this. Pascal's wager is certainly an effort on his part to allow that there is no certainty when it comes to belief in God. But he goes on to say, when you think about it, there's almost no certainty in any aspect of life. Mathematics, yes. Geometry, yes. But in other concrete facts of life, you and I are always making wagers. You and I are always betting because there is nothing that is certain. It is not certain, for example, says Pascal, that the sun will rise tomorrow. But you and I bet nonetheless, in the face of that uncertainty, that it will, and we act accordingly. So this is not a proof for the existence of God by any means whatsoever. It is written for people who are sitting on the fence, neither for atheists or for theists, and we ought not to be unduly disturbed by the fact that it is a bet, because you and I bet all the time. As a side note here, I almost suspect that Pascal was directing this argument towards those aristocratic men of the world, those gamblers who had come to him for gambling advice, who appeared to neither believe nor disbelieve in God, just simply didn't have much time for that in living their lives. So what is Pascal's wager? Well, he tells us this. We have two choices. God either exists or God doesn't exist. And remember, reason won't be able to determine which of them is the case and which is not the case. So what we have to do in a probabilistic kind of way is play the odds, if I can use a gambling metaphor. What we have to do is to see if there is more probability on one side than the other. Again, we can't focus upon probability measured by reason. So what can we measure it by? Well, Pascal says we can measure it by happiness, This is the way the wager goes. If I wager that God doesn't exist, and therefore I don't want to change anything about my life because there's nothing that's going to be judging me, and there's no opportunity for a richer life than I now have, and if God doesn't exist, I have lost absolutely nothing. It has been a totally safe bet. If, however, I bet that God does exist, that's the wager I make, and God does exist, look at what's happened here. I have made a finite bet, my life, in the hope of winning an infinite return. That's a good bet. says Pascal. Betting a finite something in the hopes of winning an infinite something is a wager that only a fool would pass up because the dividend promises so much. However, if I bet against the existence of God, and God in point of fact does exist, then what I've done is to have lost that infinite return that otherwise would have been mine. So probability suggests that we ought to go with that bet, that is, betting that God does exist, if we want to maximize our happiness. Because, of course, finite happiness that we might experience in this life is nothing compared to the infinite bliss that will be our reward if God does exist. Now, I granted, if we look at the Pascalian wager just in these terms, it does seem awfully transactional, doesn't it? It might come across almost as the kind of hucksterism that Hitchens wants to claim it is. Or we might see that there's some value in William James' insistence that any religious belief won solely because one hopes for a reward is unworthy of the Creator. But I don't think that that's what Pascal is up to, and this is why. Pascal argues that if we bet that God exists, that will mean that we change aspects of our life. That will mean, for example, that we begin to wean ourselves away from inordinate desires which may give us immediate pleasure, but which do nothing really to enrich our existences in this life as virtuous, fulfilled human beings. If we begin to wager that God exists, we might, for example, begin to cultivate more humility than we otherwise have right now. We might wean ourselves of our ambition or our lust for material goods. And in their place, we cultivate virtues, which philosophers going all the way back to Aristotle have insisted will make our lives much richer than they otherwise would have been. So in wagering that God exists, we're not simply hoping to gain a reward in the afterlife. We're also doing something that can change our lives here and now. And what that means is this. In weaning ourselves from vices, let's just be honest, in weaning ourselves from those habits and those activities that tend to cloud the mind and sully the heart's mindfulness, what we're doing is making ourselves more reflectively open to the possibility of transcendence. We're not allowing ourselves to become admired in the here and now, in the warp and the woof of a pleasure-seeking and overly busy life. We are opening ourselves up to the possibility that something besides this exists, and that something is God. Does that mean that we automatically, once we make the wager, believe in God if we've been sitting on that fence? Well, no, of course not. Pascal isn't that silly. Pascal isn't that clumsy a psychologist. But he does think, and I think we can go back to Aristotle for this as well, that habituation is important in cementing our beliefs and our actions. And if we make the wager that God exists and we begin acting as if God exists, we open ourselves up to what a Christian would call grace. And sooner or later, our acting like we believe in God will help us to believe in God with the help of God's grace. So what the wager does is to create in us a disposition to believe in God. It's not a hucksterous attempt to Shanghai us and drag us where our principles and our integrity won't allow us to go, nor is it an unworthy trying to con one's way or buy one's way into heaven. It is instead, I would suggest to you, my friends, a very sensitive invitation for those people who haven't made up their minds about God to weigh the probability and to act accordingly. And that's why, because atheists miss that point, they miss the mark when it comes to Pascal's wager. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. God bless.